Well, hello everyone. This is the second of our lockdown Thursdays. Well, I'm just trying to keep the ball rolling with our rehearsal schedule by having a chat about some of the pieces we're doing. And obviously, one of the most significant pieces we've been rehearsing is the Requiem by Herbert Howells. Now, I appreciate that probably for some of you, Herbert Howells is a bit of a closed book. Perhaps haven't ever sung anything by him before. Most of you know that I run a choir that sings in a cathedral during the summer for a week. In fact, some of you join me doing that, which is a very nice thing to do. We couldn't do it this year, but we hope we'll be able to resume next year with a bit of luck. Now, if you sing in cathedral music circles, then Howells will be a very familiar name because he's most famous probably for all the settings of the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, the evening canticles for choral evensong that he's composed over the years. He first of all composed the setting known as Collegium Regale or Col Reg for King's College, Cambridge, around about the 1940s, when he was associated with Cambridge as helping out during the war while other people were absent. And then he's proceeded to compose a huge number of settings of these same words, the My Soul doth magnify the Lord, and the Nunc Dimittis, Lord let his other servant depart in peace. I thought I might check up and find out for myself exactly how many of these we've done over the years. So we've done 9 settings. There's Col Reg, that we've done frequently. We've done, my favourite ones are the one for Gloucester Cathedral and for St Paul's Cathedral. Also there's a Westminster service, Westminster Abbey, Worcester, York. The York Minster service is not done very often, but as we sang in York twice, we did learn that one, and that's quite a challenging service. There's one for St John's College, Cambridge, and then there's 2 which are just known as their key, B minor and Howells in G. So for those in the cathedral world, Howells is something of a, sacred cow. He's kind of quite special. He's certainly one of the main composers of English church music in the 20th century. I'm not quite sure whether he's the most significant composer of English church music ever. People who like their Tudor music will probably argue with that, but he's certainly a significant person. But outside of that cathedral world, he's probably not so well known. He was born 1892. He died just about his 90th year, and had a long and fairly productive life. But he's therefore of that generation that were around during the First World War, and in fact he was quite lucky not to have to go to the war himself, because he had a diagnosis of something called Graves' disease, which could have actually caused him serious illness and even death. But in actual fact, he ended up living to the age of 90, so it wasn't such a bad thing for him. So he was that generation that were students in that sort of second decade of the 20th century. He was very much associated with the Royal College of Music, went up there as a student, and then later, of course, taught there for many years. My former colleague and piano teacher up at RGS, Stephen Armstrong, was actually, likes to talk about how he was taught by Howells, but it was only, must have been very, very briefly, but it was in that the latter part of the 1970s, somewhere around there. So that's a little bit about Howells. And the other significant thing about Howells, of course, and especially about this particular Requiem, is the supposed connection between his personal tragedy and the piece. Howells very tragically lost his son, Michael, at the age of 9. They went on holiday and Michael contracted polio. Very interesting really, and particularly in the light of what we're living through at the moment. The polio virus, as many of you probably are aware, was something that was rife at certain times and in different parts of the world, and is even now not been found a cure to, but of course is vaccinated against. And so it has, that while the virus hasn't been cured, it's been repressed sufficiently for most of us not to have to worry about it. And of course we all hope that happens with the current virus. But apparently Michael, his son, died in about 1930 5, so I think it was, and in fact, people thought first of all, because the Howells Requiem didn't surface until the 1980s, that he kept it back because of his association with the piece and with Michael's death. But in fact, he composed it in 1932, 33, so he actually composed it before Michael's death. It was actually Hymnus Paradisi, which is his one big large-scale orchestral choral work that uses large tracts of the Requiem and sort of amplifies it into a large-scale piece lasting an hour or so. That piece was definitely associated with Michael, and Howells is sort of working out of his grief. But perhaps the Requiem itself in its original form, like how we're singing it, was more a Requiem for those who died in the First World War. That's now the current thinking, which is interesting. I think I have mentioned this. The Requiem itself is not a typical Requiem. In fact, almost all Requiems by different composers very few of them are typical. They all have different sections that the composers leave out, put in, add in. Benjamin Britten's famous War Requiem adds in lots of poetry from Wilfred Owen while still using texts like the Agnus Dei and Benedictus and so forth. So Requiems all vary. This particular Requiem, as you all know now, is in 6 sections. The first section, Salvator Mundi, which is O Saviour of the World. So that's a kind of Requiem text. Then Psalm 23, then Requiem 1, as it's called, which is the Requiem Aeternam text. Then another psalm setting, Psalm 121, and then Requiem 2, second sort of setting of those similar words. And then finally, the text, I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, which is a sort of like an English version, I suppose, of an In Paradisum, which tends to often be the last movement of a Requiem, certainly in the hands of Fauré and Rufflet. So that's just a bit of stuff in general. What about Howells' language? Some of you may have found his language rather unusual. Some people may feel it sounds quite modern, but not very modern. It's kind of in that sort of area. I think he was quite influenced by various early 20th century composers, particularly Vaughan Williams. Apparently, the piece perhaps he was most inspired by, and the occasion, was when he sat in Gloucester Cathedral for what possibly might have been the premiere, or certainly a very early performance of Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis, which is that gorgeous piece for strings, which is based on an old Tallis hymn tune. Something like that, and apparently Howells actually was sitting next to Vaughan Williams on that occasion and kind of was awestruck by that occasion and by meeting the great man and so forth. So there is that kind of early 20th century modern but still with a pastoral sort of romantic feel that is very, very English, that infuses Howells' music. But he does take a little bit further, 1 or 2 ideas. One is that the mode, I mean, Vaughan Williams obviously liked the mode. The whole thing about Vaughan Williams is Fantasia on the thing on Thomas Tallis is that it uses the Phrygian mode, which is the mode from E to E, which is a particularly cold mode, if you know what I mean. Not just because it's called a Phrygian mode, spelled with a PH, of course, but it has that first interval is just a semitone. So Howells got into modes, as many of the English composers did in that early part of the century. Particularly probably they were influenced, as indeed many French composers were, Ravel and others, by the music of the past. And so for the English composers, they're probably being influenced by Thomas Tallis and William Byrd and so forth. But the particular mode that Howells kind of like more or less invents is a sort of hybrid mode, really. It consists of the raised fourth, which is, so it's a bit like the F to F, which is known as the Lydian mode, but Howells combines that raised fourth there with the flattened seventh. The best example of that is actually in here, in the towards the end of the piece, page 27. It's this moment. We haven't done this bit yet, but it's from bottom of page 27. You actually hear it quite blatantly. That in the bass part. So that's the example of Howells' own mode. But there are other examples of other modes being used. Requiem 2 starts with the Phrygian mode, right, like here. That sound. And then he also uses the Dorian mode, the mode based on D to D. And that's used most of the time in the Psalm 121 setting. This is what, again, we haven't done yet. Will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. So there's plenty of Dorian mode floating around in that particular setting. That sort of sound. Now Dorian, also mentioning it's D to D, I mean also any of these modes can be transposed to other keys, but Dorian mentioning D to D, there are certain notes that are clearly very important in this piece, and one of those notes is D, and the other is surely B. So D, of course, D major has two sharps in it. B minor is the relative minor, so it also has two sharps in it. So surely that's not a coincidence. So there's a sort of sense in which the tonal centre, if you like, it's not necessarily in a definite key all the time, but the tonal centre is D, but inflecting with B minor. The first movement starts with that sort of sense of keep returning to D, although it feels like a bit G minorish, but it's actually keeps returning to D, and but then till the bottom of the second page. There's our first full B minor chord of the piece, and then we stay around there for some while, don't we? Again, there's little inflections of the Phrygian mode in that. So that's and then we actually end, it moves on. We've done this bit, and then here towards the end of the page 4. And then sort of D major chord there, like a sort of tierce to biggity. Very much a D chord, even though it's not in the key of D, is it? Sort of, it's that sort of feel. It's what we call a modal approach to the D. And then elsewhere we get lots of the B minor. Again, in Requiem 2 starts with is in the key, feels like it's roughly in the key of B minor. It moves around a bit. When you get to the page turn, we get the double choir bit, page 10, to in this section. And that's that's a very interesting section because it also introduces another notion of Howells's, which is that of using clusters of notes. So we're again overlaying one choir with another to get that amazing group of notes at that point, which is in one choir and in the other choir. So that's kind of like an E7 chord and a C sharp major chord. So the clash of the E's, very exciting. And the sun comes out and it all clears. So this little bit, page 12. Again, B minor being influenced but emphasised, but also the semitone, Phrygian mode also being emphasised. So everywhere you see, it's all a very much kind of mode. Well, it's a kind of brief introduction to some of the things that are going on. I've found a few good recordings of this piece. It was first recorded, and I had this CD, in fact I even might have had a record of it, by Matthew Best and the Corridon Singers, though they seem to have, I don't know whether we don't hear so much about them these days, but I can't find that version on YouTube, but there are 3 versions that I have found quite easily on YouTube. One is by the Dale Warland Singers, who are a Canadian professional choir. They're very good and they do nice tempos. It's almost a little bit too fast, but they're pretty good. There's another American, there's an American Texas choir called Conspirare, who are also pretty solid. There's an English version by Paul McCreesh and the Gabrieli Consort, but their tempos are almost too slow. They sing it very beautifully, but it's almost too slow. So, as you know, people have different views on these sort of things. Anyway, I hope that's a kind of something to kind of give you something to think about. Do listen to it as much as you can, because it's a whole language, and if you get into that sort of modal language, I think that will help you to see where your line is going and what your line's doing. Because one of the things about, just a final point about Howells's technique, is that he does have very much a linear approach to a lot of his compositions, and so your lines are important, even if they're not doing quite what you expect them to do. There is a sense of line. It's not just, although there are some of it's kind of impressionistic chords, other bits are actually really proper lines like you get in Tudor music and so forth. Anyway, that's probably enough. Have a nice time. Have a nice time listening, and I hope we look forward to seeing you soon when we can meet again. But meanwhile, happy listening. Okay, bye for now.